In China, AI is never treated as a neutral or technical tool, but it is instead seen and regulated as a political technology.
Is AI training on a copyrighted work a copying? When a human reads a book, it does not trigger copyright. How about when a machine reads it?
Our Supreme Court has been backing this very strong protection, even saying that freedom of speech has a preferential position among other rights in our federal constitution.
None of the companies performed in an excellent way. The highest score was 60% out of 100.
Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for sticking with us in this beautiful Saturday afternoon. Let me introduce the speakers that will be joining us. We have with us Professor Gee Chen. Professor Chen is an associate professor of global media and information law and director of the Center for Chinese Law and Policy at Durham Law School in the UK. Welcome. Next, we have K.S. Park. K.S. is a professor at Korea University Law School. Welcome, K.S. Then we have Carlos Affonso Souza, who's a professor at the State University of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. Hi, Carlos. And our fourth speaker is Jordi Calvet, who already introduced himself. So, like Jordi was explaining, we are going to be discussing their recent research project that took about a year and went into 6 different countries in a conversation that is, at least to me, exciting. There's a lot of talk about AI and a lot of need for nuances in this conversation. And part of providing that nuance is looking at specific uses of AI and specific impacts of AI in specific and concrete rights. Although this may appear obvious, it's not necessarily that obvious in every AI conference, at least that I've been to. So welcome and thank you so much. Can we start with you, Gee? And can you share a little bit of your findings about China?
Thank you. So it's a pleasure to be part of this panel. I joined this program a couple of months ago, and my contribution to this report looks at China's legal approach to generative AI and freedom of expression. So what I find is that in China, AI is never treated as a neutral or technical tool, but it is instead seen and regulated as a political technology. So I looked at the laws, and the legal framework is quite extensive. We all know that there are cybersecurity laws, data laws, content governance rules, and most recently, very detailed government regulations on generative AI. Algorithmic recommendation, and deep synthesis. So together, these laws and regulations impose very strict obligations on platforms and developers to pre-screen, filter, and label content. This covers a lot of fields like copyright, like defamation, like obscenity, hate speech, or anything else that the Chinese government considers politically sensitive. So the effect is actually twofold. On one hand, of course, censorship is deeply embedded into the architecture of AI. On the other hand, which I think is perhaps more significant because we just heard a nice report, that is the Chinese party state uses AI proactively for propaganda. For example, the laws that I looked at, 2019 provisions prescribe that all the platforms must promote what is called positive energy content. And what is that? The Xi Jinping thought, policy, Chinese Communist Party policies, and of course, a three-dimensional comprehensive image of China to the world. And to me, this marks a transition from defensive speech regulation to what I would call a quite offensive model where AI is used to push party narratives outward. So the best example, I think, is just the DeepSeek that we heard very frequently. Everyone knows it's not just, it doesn't just block politically sensitive questions and answers. It actually generates only answers that echo the party state in Beijing, what its talking points are. So this is quite different from what we think. And of course, it tries its best to use this as in what I would call arithmetic propaganda. And it's already generating global repercussions. Several countries have already restricted and banned DeepSeek over concerns about disinformation and political influence, I would say. So one of the key takeaways in my report is that in the Chinese AI legal regime not only suppresses freedom of expression domestically, but of course tries to drive and projects authoritarian influences abroad. So trying to shape the international information space. So this kind of global, I think this is this raises urgent questions for all of us. How, for example, should liberal democracies respond where AI is used not only to censor but also to export propaganda abroad? So this is the global question that I hope today's panel could take forward. I'll stop here, probably.
Great. Well, thank you very much for your insights. Let me move to KS. KS, do you want to share a little bit of your insights and your report with us?
Sure. Korea passed a law modeled after EU AI Act. Now, humanity has automated one activity after another, automobiles, dishwashers, etc. Finally, AI has automated thinking or decision-making, which is clearly a First Amendment activity. The common problem with the Korean law and EU AI Act is that they burden this First Amendment activity just because it is carried out with a particular type of software that produces the most stochastically probable responses to human prompts. Now, these laws do not regulate AI itself, but only its applications. Hence, more burdens when the same AI is applied to certain higher risk or higher impact areas. However, these so-called high risk or high impact areas are covered already with existing regulations for the very reason that they are high risk or high impact. So what these new laws end up doing is to make it more difficult to comply with the existing standards of safety and fairness if you try to do it with this new probabilistic software. Result is that it has the danger of not only holding back the power of AI to make safer or more ethical decisions, but also making those areas less safe and less fair. Now, I'm not saying that AI only augments a First Amendment activity, and therefore there should not be an AI regulation. There are aspects of AI that need public intervention, if not regulation, tailored to the unique nature of the current version of AI, which is that it is based on machine learning. First, better availability of the training data so that the benefits of AI is not limited only to the big players who can purchase it. Second, better data governance to protect privacy of people whose personal data is used for AI training. Finally, making the training data better in quality, meaning removing bias, hate, falsity, so they do not get amplified. Now, on better data availability, copyright law. I think will dutifully follow whatever the first word decides on the fateful question: is AI training on a copyrighted work a copying? When a human reads a book, it does not trigger copyright. How about when a machine reads it? Now, open government data. Now, I'm going to Spain to Open Government Partnership Summit after this. Government is the source of a lot of useful data by definition. Early this year in France, we launched Current AI, an attempt to pull multi-governmental data sets for open sourcing around the world exactly for this purpose. We have not seen similar movement in Korea. On better data privacy, Korea has GDPR-style data protection law, but its mechanistic application is reducing the availability of personal data. For example, Korean court decisions are still not available for machine learning because of data protection concerns. Also, identifying someone in a critical news article or a criminal complaint obviously involves non-consensual processing of personal data, but it is being criminalized in Korea. Finally, overprotectiveness of personal data led to this ironic rule that even de-identification is allowed only in exchange for an absolute commitment that it will never be re-identified. Now, as you know, some data subject rights require re-identification, and those rights are paralyzed because of this absolute ban on re-identification. On better data ethics, Korea has suffered, as many other countries in Asia, from the vertical social structure whereby people look up for a solution, then look across one another for it. It is already shown in Korea's AI Basic Act, which makes the government's role prominent in vetting high-impact AI. This opens up a possibility for government censorship on the training data. In the end, we have to see AI in continuum of technological progress, whereby greater human activities have been automated, and international human rights standards should be applied to AI activities with this in mind. In that regard, Korea's two other laws stand out as, I think, knee-jerk reactions to fear of AI. Complete or near-complete bans on deepfakes in electoral and sexual context. Electoral law bans all deepfakes, consensual or non-consensual, truthful or false, parody or satire. Sex crime law rightly bans only non-consensual deepfakes, but again does not require factual falsehood and has no exception for satire or parody. So it has the potential, for instance, of banning the famous virtual nude figurine of President Trump.
Thank you, Gaius. As I was listening to you, I was thinking about how generative AI particularly is usually thought of as experimental technology, and I was thinking how the different laws in the different countries take this experimental fact into account. How do they build it in regulating these new technologies? But I'll leave that question for later, and I'll give the floor to Carlos.
So thank you, Agustina. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me just begin looking to the clock and to see my 5 minutes that I have, just to calculate myself. I'm from humanities, so sometimes I have a hard time figuring out how to duly calculate. So let me thank our friends from the Future of Free Speech, especially Jacob, Jordi. It was a pleasure working with you guys in this project. And let me just give you some information about what's going on in Brazil concerning AI regulation with some focus on free speech. So Brazil, it's on the verge of approving a general law on artificial intelligence. This law, or this bill of law, has been approved in the Senate and is now being discussed in the House of Representatives. It's a very broad law that is partially inspired by the European AI Act, with some tweaks of originality here and there, just like a chapter on rights. And rights that are granted to, and I have a hard time grasping this name, which is person or groups affected by AI. Like, I really think that we should look into this wording with a little bit of more attention, because when you have a law that says that there is a person or a group that is affected by AI, it seems like this is the exception. So people who are affected by AI are the exception, and we all know AI is and will be even more like everywhere. So to say that someone is affected by AI, by the end of the day, that will be pretty much everyone. But just let me give you some context before I pinpoint some of the key elements of this bill of law that is being discussed right now in the House of Representatives. So Brazilian constitution has a very robust protection for freedom of speech. And in the last, I would say at least 10 years, our Supreme Court has been backing this very strong protection, even saying that freedom of speech has a preferential position among other rights in our federal constitution. But from, I would say, 10, 11 years from now, the waters are changing, and that is mostly due to what we see online. So Brazil has approved a federal law called the Brazilian Internet Bill of Rights back in 2014. This law has an immunity, a safe harbor provision for digital platforms concerning speech, saying that they will only be held liable if they fail to comply with a judicial order requesting one specific content to be struck down. So it's very protective to freedom of speech to begin with. But since then, it's been 11 years now, a lot of things happen. We had this perception of online harms increasing, not only in the Brazilian internet, but especially in the Brazilian context. We had a lot of discussions concerning content moderation and hate speech and misinformation during the COVID pandemic. So content moderation ended up turning to a public debate. In terms of political speech, we end up having this materialization of violence in our January 8th, 2023, when people end up invading our capital city and storming public buildings. So as the US has your own January 6th, we have our January 8th. And that ended up leading to the perception that especially social media had a role to play in this context. And authorities began to feel anxious about it and need to do something. So what ended up being done on this front, the Supreme Court decided that the safe harbor for digital platforms was too broad. And now they had just issued a decision, like last July, saying that the safe harbor for digital platforms will only work for defamation cases. For all of the rest, we are resorting to a notice-and-takedown regime most of the time, and creating stricter liability provisions for advertisements, paid boosted content on social media, and so on. And of course, this is all under the context of having this tug-of-war between Elon Musk and Justice Moraes, with Elon saying that he would not comply with judicial orders coming out of the Brazilian Supreme Court. And of course, the tensioning of the relations between the US and Brazil end up getting to this whole mixture of digital sovereignty and how to understand the regulation of new technologies. So this is the background in which we are seeing this new bill of law on AI being discussed. So if it's true on one hand that Brazilians are very much eager to use new technologies such as generative AI applications, when it comes to regulation, we might end up seeing some texts that might curb the way in which speech could be made through those platforms. So let me just conclude with some of the topics of this bill of law, and I'll be very quickly here. Just to mention 3 topics. One is our Brazilian bill of law on AI will somewhat be inspired by the European approach of have a risk matrix on having some deployments of AI that are prohibited, some that are high risk, and some that are low risk. So the Brazilian bill of law end up getting a solution in which when you decide what type of liability regime you're going to deploy when you look into artificial intelligence, the ranking of the risk might be influential on which type of liability regime you are going to deploy. So higher the risk, you might be increasing your chances of having a strict liability, a liability without fault of being applied. Second issue that I think is really interesting, Brazil has a very descriptive provision on AI in elections that is very interesting, that is being issued by the Brazilian Superior Electoral Court. And one of the provisions is the banning of avatars. So the court understood that Brazilians would, when it comes to media literacy, might not really understood what an avatar was. So in order to avoid people on mistaking what the avatar is saying with what the candidate is saying, they decided to prohibit avatar as a whole. And a third and final point, as KS has mentioned, I think we'll be seeing a lot of this interplay/conflict between data protection and artificial intelligence, especially because the Brazilian bill ended up giving the data protection authority the oversight competence to regulate and to oversee the application of the AI law. So we have the very same administrative body working with data protection and in artificial intelligence at the same time. But I'll just stop here, and thanks a lot for this opportunity to share some thoughts about what's going on in Brazil on this AI regulation front.
Cool.
Thanks.
Does the law actually mention the word avatar?
Yeah.
I just love that.
Who will tell?
Of course. Thanks so much, Carlos. And Jordi, you're going to talk about a little bit of the situation in the European Union and in the US, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yeah, that's right. So on this second component on countries, and perhaps as a bit of background, say that we developed, with the support of the experts, a questionnaire including several questions, just so people know more or less what we were covering, which included restrictions on specific AI models, legislation on hate speech, on disinformation, on defamation. We also considered the freedom of expression state in that country according to VDEM, to Freedom House, and then measures empowering freedom of expression. And we sort of had this ranking that ranked the US as first, and then the European Union as second. Then it had, just for further background, Brazil, Korea, India, and China. When it comes to the US, as I just said in a chapter that I drafted with my colleague Jacob Shangama and Isabel Anzabi, the United States performed the best overall based on that questionnaire, and the main reasons for that was the First Amendment, the strong First Amendment protection, in addition to the lack of major restrictions on AI at the federal level. Now, what this means, the fact that there is no legislation at the federal level means that there is a patchwork of legislation at the state level, which did raise some concerns in some instances. In particular, or I will highlight, let's say, obligations or bans on political deepfakes under certain circumstances, which that was concerning. Then, as of next year, as we continue this exercise in coming years, we will be paying attention to the judicial interpretation of the First Amendment in the context of AI, as well as the actions of the administration, of course. Now, when it comes to the European Union, which is, as I said, ranked second, but performed strongly, it did so mainly because of the strong protection in principle on freedom of expression in the European Convention on Human Rights and the Charter of Fundamental Rights. At the same time, that we were concerned about some provisions in the AI Act, in the Digital Services Act, which is Europe's online safety rulebook, provisions in particular on systemic risk, which have already been discussed in this conference, were of particular concern. The reason for that is because these provisions are very, very vague. And just to give you an example, when it comes to the AI Act, the provision on mitigating systemic risk means reducing negative effects on society as a whole, which of course is very broad, what is bad for society as a whole. Now, in further guidance, non-binding guidance, it includes, for example, radicalizing content, which one could see how this might be used in the context of protests, like in the case of the Yellow Vest protests in Paris, in France, a few years ago, or in the case of criticism of the governments. So those are my 2 cents on when it comes to the countries, the European Union and the US. Now, should I go on to the models as well? Yeah. Okay. There, I would say that what we did was basically analyze what we call the free speech culture of the AI models. And for that, what we did was analyze the willingness of the different models to engage on open discourse and diverse perspectives. And we did that through, let's say, 3 key questions. The first question was what are users allowed to do in theory? Meaning, when we look at the usage policies, which guide, of course, what we can and cannot do, what do the usage policies say? What is the commitment of the companies on freedom of expression, etc. Second component was what can actually users do? What can they do in practice regardless of those policies? And we tested that with prompts. We had 64 prompts per model, so 512 in total, on topics ranging from left to right. Think DEI, systemic racism, Marine Le Pen's ban in the presidential election in France, whether Bolsonaro should be in jail or not, etc. That was the second component or the second question, let's say. The third question is, what do we know, however limited, on the training of the different models? Now, quick findings on that. We were encouraged by what we saw compared to the previous year, where we conducted a similar preliminary exercise. Models were willing to reply twice as often than last year. They, except for Alibaba, replied to most of our prompts, so that worked. Their model cards also of several companies refer to viewpoint diversity and the need to engage with diverse perspectives. Now, the problem was there was a problem that remained there, which is the usage policies, which continue to be very vague, very broad, and not aligned with robust free speech standards. And now, as a quick overview of the ranking, XAI ranked first. Then we had OpenAI. I'll just double check to make sure that OpenAI, Anthropic, Google, and Meta, very close to XAI. And the last one was Alibaba. I will say that this is the ranking. None of the companies performed in an excellent way. The highest score was 60%, so out of 100. But we've seen some encouraging signs, as I said.
Interesting. I was hearing Jacob Shapiro yesterday explaining their research, and it might be interesting to compare notes and see.
Yeah, I mean, indeed, it was part of this project. So what we did was we conducted this analysis on usage policies, on training, and a prompt exercise, let's say more manual, and then Jake's team conducted this more automated analysis, and I would say that they are quite consistent. So,
interesting. So we have food for thought and data for research, which is always cool. So since you all touched upon legislation, and this is a big part of what you guys were looking at, I'm wondering, one of the things that we keep seeing around the world is the criminalization of certain speech. And with generative AI, I don't think that's the exception. At least KS mentioned instances of criminalization. Do you want to give us a little bit more about the debate that went into it, or how this new criminal figures fit into a broader scheme of freedom of expression? KS or Ge?
Well, especially use of deep fakes for electoral context has a precedence, actually ample precedence in American states as well. It's just that the American laws have exceptions for satire, parody, and also require some construction of false reality as a element of the crime. It's just that Korean law was made in such haste that they just decided to ban all deep fakes in electoral context. And hearing from Carlos, I guess it was also a case in Brazil. They just banned avatars, means, you know, it is also made with deep fakes. So even if you put up an avatar who repeats genuine positions of the candidates, it will still be criminalized. It's still banned. Yeah. Well, I mean, the impact is, the legal issue is glaring at us. I mean, it's completely unconstitutional to burden political speech more than like economic speech, right? I mean, it's okay to use deep fakes for advertising, advertising cars and commercial products. You cannot use deep fakes for electoral purposes. I think so. Anyway, I'll have more to report because we filed a constitutional challenge yesterday, and maybe I can come back to report on that next year.
And I'm just jump in with some example from Brazil. So this rule end up banning avatars, but the usage of AI itself is not prohibited in elections in Brazil. If you use AI, you need to identify the video. So there are some like banners, obligations. And of course, we all know that all those labeling obligations are something that is still controversial. There are some studies that shows that, especially in the political discourse, when you label a video as being edited with AI, users tend to do not trust the candidate that much, because if AI was at some point used in this video, it would use it in which way? How can I trust this video? So I think there is still some controversies around the labeling obligations. And then when it comes to the discussion about AI for elections, it seems to me that we are mimicking a bit what we've been through with social media, which is this discussion between a private set of rules set out by companies to organize one specific space, and the existence, of course, of the national laws that will be deployed on those users and the usage of this social media, for instance, in this particular country. When it comes to AI, it seems to me it's the very same thing. As Jordi was going through the discussion about the models, we're seeing this conversation between the rules, the policies that the companies end up deploying to organize the usage of this AI tool, but at the same time, governments will want to step in and say that this specific usage might be prohibited, might be harmful in itself. And I think that's where the tensions we are going to see pretty much clear in all different countries.
maybe a short word about the case of Chinese law, which is, I think, quite complicated and nuanced. Because all the current AI laws and regulations in China are all channeled to the traditional regime of criminalizing political speech in a way that I just mentioned. The platform obligations would be imposed on practically all companies in their training processes, in their designing, in their monitoring of the platforms, and so on. Now, take any of those fields that I just referred to as an example, such as copyright. We might think that copyright is just commercial law. It's business law. No, it isn't. So the copyright law in China is contrary to what is prescribed here in the U.S. Constitution, is not an engine of free expression. It's copyright without free expression, as I call it in my work. So just give you a very simple example. The Copyright Bureau in China is simultaneously the authority of censorship. It's called the National Administration for Press and Publication. The same team with two names, Copyright Bureau, and the name actually the censorship body. So it's copyright law is part of the censorship law itself. So any AI regulations, any obligations must be channeled to this. So if anything goes wrong, the party state will find you, and there will be criminalization of copyright infringement, of denying your copyright for the purpose of simply, just preventing anyone from benefiting from this system of copyright law. And finally, I think it's important to note that despite the constitutional protection of free speech in the Chinese constitution, no court in China is allowed to invoke any constitutional clause in any civil, criminal, or administrative proceedings or judgment. Nothing. So it's just on paper. And it is called the People's Democratic Dictatorship. So somebody just asked me yesterday about the way how China reinterprets democratic language. So it is actually, the democratic way. You people just elected me through that process, which I call is democratic, the People's Congress. So the single candidate is elected, and that is, according to the party, democratic. And once the person comes to power, it is a different thing. So it is called, by definition, in the constitution of the PRC, People's Democratic Dictatorship.
Yeah, perhaps because I'm aware of the time, just one quick thought. One of the reasons why the European Union lost some points was because of its broad provisions on hate speech, partly criminal provisions. And there's, in addition to that, there's also some provisions, not criminal in that case, in the Digital Services Act, which basically, as implemented in the guidance, require companies to take down the content quite quickly, which of course can lead to quite a lot of or over removal of content, let's say. And I will also say that the European Court of Human Rights has had a controversial approach on this. Our colleague Natalie Alqueviado has a good book, recent book on that. So if you're interested, I encourage you all to read it.
Interesting. So I'll go back to the question that I asked you guys in the middle of your presentations, and then I'll open up the floor to questions from the audience. This is well-known experimental technology. Companies sell it as experimental technology. They are developing it as experimental technology. So do the laws, or did any of the laws that you came across in your research account for the experimental nature? Do they foresee impact assessments, periodic reviews of how the laws are working and how they may or may not be infringing disproportionately on rights? Was this something that was at all debated during the enactment of this legislation?
I can start if you'd like. With the advent of generative AI, what we did see is that the EU AI Act included provisions on what they call general purpose AI models. So we did see that inclusion. Now the AI Act may be modified, and now there's some sort of push to sort of pause some of its provisions. Now, the way I see it in Europe, and that's just it's been my experience, my impression, there's quite a lot of support in terms of, let's say, restricting and allowing only good content. So I don't see, for example, the problematic provisions that I mentioned on systemic risk being scrapped, but I do think they should be clarified. So that would be my take from Europe.
So actually, the Chinese legislature is now considering proactively the model of a European AI Act, which is now being discussed. So I think 2-3 years ago, the Chinese experts on AI law have proposed such a bill. I think part of that is also based on some of the provisions in European data protection law and other kinds of laws that are related to AI. Now, the existing regulations, it's not the law enacted by the People's Congress, which is the supreme Chinese legislature. It's not the parliament, by the way. But the legislature itself has certainly deputized the state council to make to create some kind of quasi legislation, you can call it, the government regulations on generative AI. And the government certainly puts a lot of its own initiatives into that kind of regulations, including certainly national security considerations above all. So if there are any experiments, I would say, for example, labeling the content itself in the deep synthesis, right, like deepfake, these kinds of experimental rules, but are now still not the formal laws in China, I should say.
I don't know whether Korea is closer to Europe than Nashville is, but I think the wind in Europe has changed after passage of EU AI Act. I went to Paris AI Action Summit that happened in February this year, and President Macron made a closing remark where he said, "Oh, France will be the leader of global AI race." Why? Because AI takes a lot of energy, and France has kept the nuclear power, has an abundance of energy, and can invite all the developers to France. Now, with so many people on the left in France, nobody booed with 1,000 people in the audience. And I could see formation of this consensus that AI is to be developed, not to be regulated. And then many of the sessions at the Action Summit were more about development than ethics or regulation. And EU AI Act already has a sandbox provision. Now, Korea AI Act doesn't have sandbox. I don't know, browsing. Okay, all right. So I don't think the experimental nature, which should caution people, is not really doing the job. I think around the world, it's a fair game. It is a race already.
And when you look into Brazil, like I remember as a small kid in school, learning that every single literary movement in Europe, it arrives in Brazil with somewhat like a 60 to 80 years delay. So when Europe was deciding that this literary movement was no longer cool, Brazil was just like going forward with romanticism and so on. My concern is that the Brussels effect end up creating this very strange impact, which is countries will import a concept of an European legislation that is no longer dear to the Europeans in the first place, because technology has changed. Authorities in Europe has like a new thoughts about the legislation. So this delay on importing and bringing home ideas that were not created there, I think it's something that we'll be seeing a lot in the region. I'm looking to Latin America here, but I can see this movement happening elsewhere as well. And let me just conclude saying, the Brazilian Bill of Law has some room for experimentation through sandboxes, but I always get me thinking that the regulation of new technologies is in itself a technology that we need to perfect, that we need to make it better. And sometimes I get this strange feeling that sandboxes is not enough, that we are coming out with a piece of legislation with a full set of rules and compliance rules that might end up leading us to an empty bureaucracy that people will just check boxes. And at the same time, importing large administrative governance structures out of the European example that will land in countries in which there is no state bureaucracy capable and with the resources that the Europeans might have to deploy the analysis, the impacts, and by the end of the day, the enforcement of the law. So a bunch of challenges for Brazil and for the region, but just to reflect a bit upon the topics that we all mentioned here in this panel.
Great. Well, we run out of time, but I invite you all to take a look at the faces of these 4 people and track them down at the coffee break if you have questions for them about the different countries. Thank you so much for your insights and for sharing your work with us. And thanks everyone for staying.